We have now made it to the last book of the New Testament, and so in this lecture we're going to be talking about the book of Revelation. And if you have any experience inside the church or any knowledge of Christianity and the Bible, then you probably know that this is likely the most confusing, complex book in the New Testament. So here is going to be just some introductory information, as we do on all the books, that will hopefully give you a good lens as you read through the book and as you study the other course material. So the author of this book is the Apostle John. Some scholars have thought that maybe it was a different John. There is a John in early church history that is referred to as the Elder John. But as of right now, the evidence points to it most likely being John the Apostle, one of the apostles that was in Jesus's inner circle. So, as with John's other letters that we have covered earlier this semester, the date is a little bit later than a lot of the other New Testament books. So the date is sometime around 95 AD, and by this time the church was being persecuted by the Roman emperor. So things were not easy for the early church, and so John he has this context of the church being persecuted in mind as he writes this letter. So he writes the letter to 7 churches in the province of Asia. Now, I want to point out something specific that makes the book of Revelation unique, and that is the genre. As we have made our way through the other New Testament books, we've been able to easily say that this book is an epistle, or this book is history, or a gospel. But here, it doesn't really fit just one of those. It actually could be described as 3 different genres in one. And so first, it's an epistle in that it is still a letter. It has the same format as all the other letters, such as the beginning, the greeting, the body, the closing. It has all the characteristics of the normal letters. But then it also has a lot of prophecy. It's explicitly identified as prophecy. John explicitly writes that. And then along with that, it contains elements of prophetic literature, just like the books of prophecy in the Old Testament. So this is things like messages from God to his people, warnings against unbelief, what happens for those that do not believe, and prophecies of judgment for those that do not believe and that do. Basically, that everyone will be judged according to where they fall on the issue. And then finally, the last genre that it kind of fits into is apocalypse. And this was actually a very common type of literature in Israel at the time. And it was often written during times of political instability. So when things are kind of changing in the first century world, and as governments come and go, and as different people are ruling over the Jewish people, this was just a common type of literature as people tried to make sense of what they were experiencing. And so, similar to prophecy, it is looking to what God is going to do to deliver his people. It's looking to the end to think about what is God doing. And it often is, that's often done through very symbolic language, as Revelation has all throughout it. And so it also talks about, once again, how God will judge those who sin, and there will be consequences for their disbelief, and then also about how he will establish his kingdom. So as far as reasons for writing, at least some of the church, as we have already established, some of the churches that John is writing to were experiencing persecution because of their faith. So at this point, the impact that the Roman Empire is having has continued, and they do not support Christianity, to say the least. And so persecution is widespread at this point. And so John is partially writing to encourage them in their faith, just as many of the other epistles were written about as well. But just for some more background information, John was exiled to the island of Patmos. And he writes in the beginning of Revelation that it was while he was here, he was given a vision and explicitly instructed to write what he had seen in the vision and pass it on to the seven churches. So that just pretty clearly states what his primary reason was for writing this letter. So the main message of Revelation, even though it's confusing and has so many different layers of symbols and meaning, the most basic message of the book is that God wins. No matter how bad things get in the world in terms of persecution or trials in life or suffering, God is sovereign, and the victory has been won through Jesus. And you will see that there's a lot of language in Revelation referring to Jesus as the Lamb. And you can kind of get into how that fits into the story of Jesus' life and how he was the sacrifice. But John lays it out clearly that the victory comes through Jesus' sacrifice. And through all of that, God is sovereign, and his way will be the way that things are. And then he finally focuses on how God will have a new heaven and a new earth where his people, the people that choose to believe in him, will dwell with him forever. So in the next lecture, we will actually talk about 4 different ways or lenses through which people have interpreted the book of Revelation through the years. But I want to give you here 4 more general guidelines for interpreting the book and understanding it as you read. First, recognize the symbolic nature of the imagery. These symbols point to historical realities and spiritual truths. So if you read Revelation only reading it through a very literal lens, then you're going to think it's probably the weirdest book you've ever read, and you would be missing a lot of the intended message. Instead, you should see that there are symbols all throughout. And as an example, you'll read in Revelation 9 about locusts coming from the pit, and really you get the more of the intended message when you see that this is a symbol for destructive evil. Okay, so just keep in mind as you're reading, if something just doesn't make sense, think about what it could be symbolizing of. Second, focus on general rather than specific meaning. Don't get caught up in identifying specific events or characters in the book with specific events or characters in history. I think this is something that a lot of us tend to just naturally do. We read scripture and try to look at things that are happening in our world and say, this has to be it. This has to be the fulfillment of what's in the Bible. And when we do that, I think once again we can really miss some of the main message that John is writing about. And so we need to just keep in mind that it is better to maybe focus more on the general message, the general principles that I'd already covered of what John's main message is, rather than saying mapping out the events of Revelation with specific things that we know about through history. I think when we do that, it can just get maybe more confusing, and we can just get caught up more in our world rather than what was actually on John's mind at the time. Third, the Old Testament helps explain the symbols of Revelation. So even though this is a New Testament course, the more you know about the events and the overall story of the Old Testament, I think that will help you as you read through Revelation. The book actually has more allusions to the Old Testament than any other New Testament book. And then fourth, keep the first century context in mind. The book must be understood within the world in which it was written. I think that this one is incredibly important, and even though I'd already talked about it a little bit previously, I think it needs to be at the forefront of your mind as you read. just to keep in mind what was going on in the first century, what wasn't even a possibility, things that are part of our world today. I'm thinking, in terms of technology and the culture we're in, it is not helpful to map that onto what John is writing about, because many of the parts of our life today were definitely not on John's mind when he was writing this letter. And so the more we can stay focused on the first century context and what was going on in that world in which it was written, the better off we will be. So that just kind of gives you a bird's eye view of some background information on the book of Revelation. Hopefully it will help you not be just super lost as you read.